The terminal was bustling as passengers hurried through security, eager to board their flights. Among them was James Carter, a quiet yet imposing figure in his late 50s. Dressed in a simple button-up shirt and jeans, he moved with a slight limp, his cane tapping softly against the airport floor. A proud yet humble U.S. Army veteran, James had served for over 30 years, earning multiple medals of valor before an explosion overseas left him with a permanent leg injury. James had long gotten used to the stares. People either pitied him or avoided looking at him entirely. He didn't mind. He had fought wars and lost friends. A few awkward glances meant nothing. What mattered today was getting home after a long business trip. As he reached the boarding gate, he handed his first-class ticket to the attendant, who smiled warmly. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter. Have a great flight." James nodded, returning the smile before making his way onto the plane. The aircraft's interior gleamed under the overhead lights, passengers settling into their seats. James found his first-class seat near the front, close to the aisle for easier access. He exhaled and placed his cane beside him, ready to relax for the journey ahead. That's when she arrived. Flight attendant Laura Hastings was in her early 30s, tall, well-groomed, and had the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She had worked in the airline industry for years, but her attitude often depended on who she was serving. If you looked rich or important, she was all sugar and honey. If you looked, well, like James, that was another story. Her eyes flicked to his cane, then back to his face. The friendly mask disappeared. "Sir," she said, her voice clipped, "I think you're in the wrong section." James raised an eyebrow, lifting his ticket. "No, I'm in seat 2A, first class." Laura let out a small, unimpressed laugh. "Right, I see. Well, we have limited seating up here, so I just wanted to check." James nodded slowly, already sensing her tone. It wasn't just rudeness. It was disdain. Laura turned sharply and went about her duties, but every so often she threw glances James's way. When another first-class passenger, a businessman in a tailored suit, arrived, she greeted him with a dazzling smile. "Welcome, Mr. Reynolds. May I take your coat?" She beamed. James sighed, adjusting in his seat. It was going to be a long flight. Minutes later, as passengers settled, Laura returned with a tray of drinks for the first-class section: champagne, orange juice, and water. She stopped at James's seat, barely making eye contact. "We don't have any special service accommodations, just letting you know up front." James blinked, caught off guard. "I didn't ask for any." "Well, you have that cane, so I assume you'll need extra attention." Her voice was loud enough that a few heads turned. A sinking silence filled the air. James clenched his jaw. He could feel the judgment, the assumption that he was some burden just because he had an injury. "Just the orange juice, thanks," he said, keeping his voice even. Laura smirked, slamming the glass onto his tray table before moving on without another word. James noticed a few passengers exchanging looks. Some were uncomfortable. A woman across the aisle, probably in her 40s, gave him a small, sympathetic smile. A younger man a few rows back, maybe in his 20s, narrowed his eyes at Laura. Clearly, James wasn't the only one noticing her behavior. Still, he didn't want to make a scene. Not yet. As Laura moved through the cabin, James overheard her chatting with another flight attendant, a short blonde woman named Megan. "Ugh, I swear I don't know why they let just anyone into first class," Laura muttered. Megan, looking a little uncomfortable, whispered something in response, but Laura rolled her eyes. James's fingers tightened around his cane. He had dealt with worse than this. Much worse, but something told him that this was only the beginning. The plane began taxiing, and the captain's voice echoed through the speakers, welcoming everyone aboard. James leaned back in his seat, but his mind was racing. Laura wasn't done. As the aircraft lifted off, James couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was going to test his patience. What he didn't know, however, was that Laura's arrogance was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. James tried to brush off the flight attendant's condescending attitude, but something about Laura Hastings' tone lingered in the air. It wasn't just rude. It was dismissive, belittling. He had fought wars, survived combat, and endured pain most people couldn't imagine. Yet here he was, being humiliated by a flight attendant who thought he was beneath her. The plane leveled out, and the flight attendants moved through the cabin, beginning their service. Laura, of course, made sure to ignore James as much as possible while lavishing attention on the wealthier-looking passengers. James wasn't the only one who noticed. A few seats down, a young man in his late 20s, dressed in a hoodie and jeans, kept glancing at James with a frown. He had noticed the way Laura had treated him and was clearly debating whether to say something. Across the aisle, the middle-aged woman from earlier, Mrs. Donovan, shook her head disapprovingly as she watched the flight attendant fawn over a man in a designer suit. When it was time for the meal service, Laura returned her condescending tone worse than before. She stopped at James's seat, barely making eye contact. "We have 2 meal options, grilled chicken with vegetables or pasta with marinara sauce. I assume you'll need something easy to chew?" James blinked. "Excuse me?" Laura sighed, dramatically looking annoyed. "I mean, with your, condition." She gestured vaguely toward his cane. "Do you need any special assistance? We can cut up the food for you if you need." A few heads turned. James felt heat rise. In his chest, he clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. "No, I think I can handle eating on my own," he said, keeping his voice even. Laura rolled her eyes. "Fine. What do you want?" "The chicken." Without a word, Laura slammed the tray onto his table, hard enough that the drink on his tray sloshed over the side. She didn't apologize, didn't even acknowledge it, before she turned and walked off as if nothing happened. The young man in the hoodie had had enough. He leaned forward and muttered, "Seriously? What's her problem?" James shook his head, still trying to let it go. "Some people just don't know how to treat others." Mrs. Donovan, who had also witnessed everything, leaned across the aisle. "That was absolutely unacceptable," she whispered. "You should report her." James exhaled, gripping his cane. "Let's just get through the flight." But not everyone was willing to let it slide. The young man in the hoodie, his name was Ethan, pulled out his phone, pretending to scroll through social media. But he had quietly started recording. If Laura did anything else, it was going to be on camera, and sure enough, she did. A while later, James needed to use the restroom. He reached for his cane and carefully stood up, making sure to steady himself. Laura, who had been chatting with another flight attendant near the galley, noticed immediately. She strode over, putting a hand on his shoulder before he could take another step. "Sir, you need to be careful. We don't want any accidents." James stiffened. "I can walk just fine." "Well, if you fall, it becomes a liability issue for us," Laura said sweetly. Fake concern dripped from her voice, but her eyes betrayed her annoyance. "Maybe you should just stay seated." James narrowed his eyes. "I need to use the restroom. I'll be fine." Laura huffed, crossing her arms. "Well, if you insist, just don't blame us if something happens." She stepped aside dramatically, making a show of allowing him to pass. Passengers murmured. People were paying attention now. As James slowly made his way down the aisle, Ethan discreetly captured everything on video. He exchanged a look with Mrs. Donovan. "This is going online," Ethan whispered. Mrs. Donovan nodded firmly. "Good. People need to see this." James made it to the restroom without issue, but as he returned to his seat, something had changed. He could feel it. The energy in the first-class cabin had shifted. People were whispering. And then, he heard it, a passenger a few rows back murmured to someone, "I swear I've seen him before." Another voice. "Wait, isn't that General James Carter?" James's grip on his cane tightened. He hadn't planned on revealing who he was. He never liked to throw his title around. but it seemed like his identity was about to come out whether he wanted it to or not. And when it did, Laura Hastings was going to regret every single word she had said. James felt the shift in the air the moment he returned to his seat. The whispers, the glances, the way some passengers started looking at him differently. It was clear. Someone had recognized him. Ethan, the young man in the hoodie who had been recording, leaned toward Mrs. Donovan. "Did he just say General James Carter?" Mrs. Donovan's eyebrows lifted in realization. "Oh my God, the General James Carter? The one who led the rescue mission in—" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, he's a decorated war hero. The guy's a legend in the military. There's even a documentary about him." Mrs. Donovan's eyes widened. She had been disgusted with the way Laura treated James before, but now? Now she was furious. Completely oblivious to the growing tension, Laura Hastings was still in full superior mode. She strutted back down the aisle and stopped at James's seat again. "Sir, next time, maybe just call for assistance. It would be easier for everyone." James's fingers tightened around his cane. He had held his tongue long enough. Before he could respond, Mrs. Donovan spoke up first. "Excuse me, but I don't think Mr. Carter needs your help, especially when you've done nothing but humiliate him this entire flight." A few passengers murmured in agreement. Laura frowned, her eyes flicking between them. "Ma'am, I'm just ensuring the safety of our passengers." "Oh, cut the act," Ethan snapped. He held up his phone screen, playing back a clip of Laura's behavior. "You've been rude since the moment he boarded. And you know what? I think it's time people see how you treat a disabled veteran." Laura's face drained of color. You're recording me?" "Yeah, and so are half the people in this cabin," Ethan shot back. "You might want to fix your attitude before this ends up online." Laura's cocky smirk wavered. She glanced around, suddenly noticing how many people were watching her now. And then the final blow came. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds speaking. Before we begin our descent, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge someone very special on board. We are honored to have with us today a true American hero, General James Carter, a decorated war veteran, recipient of the Medal of Honor, and a man who has dedicated his life to serving this country." The entire first-class cabin gasped. Laura's face turned ghost white. James exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. He had never cared for attention, but at this moment he didn't mind one bit. The captain continued, "General Carter, sir, it is a privilege to have you on our flight. On behalf of the entire crew, we thank you for your service." Passengers burst into applause. Laura looked like she wanted to sink through the floor. Passengers began standing up, turning toward James with admiration. A businessman in a suit reached out to shake his hand. "Sir, it's an honor." An elderly woman near the front dabbed her eyes with a tissue. "You're the reason my grandson made it home safe. Thank you." Even a few flight attendants, including Megan, the blonde who had seemed uncomfortable with Laura's attitude earlier, looked ashamed. And then the final blow. The co-pilot stepped out of the cockpit, walking directly to Laura. He was tall, stern-looking, and clearly furious. "Ms. Hastings," he said coldly, "would you please step into the galley?" Laura's hands trembled as she followed him, but not before glancing at James one last time. For the first time on this flight, she looked afraid. Laura Hastings could barely breathe. She followed the co-pilot into the galley, her hands clenched into fists, her confidence completely shattered. The smug superiority she had flaunted just minutes ago had vanished. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a way out of this. This was bad. The galley door clicked shut, leaving Laura alone with the co-pilot, Jacob Turner. He was a seasoned professional in his mid-40s and had been with the airline for years. Unlike Laura, he understood respect. He crossed his arms, staring her down. "Explain yourself." His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the edge in his tone. Laura swallowed hard. I was just doing my job, sir, making sure the passengers were—" "Cut the nonsense," Turner interrupted sharply. "We've received multiple complaints from passengers about your behavior, and now we have footage?" He tapped his Naishi earpiece, listening for a second, then his eyes darkened. "I just got word from the captain," he continued. "He's seen the video, and so has corporate." Laura's stomach dropped. Corporate? Back in first class, the tension hadn't eased. If anything, it was getting worse for Laura. Ethan, the young man who had recorded everything, was already typing out a post. Unbelievable. Flight attendant humiliates a disabled veteran who turns out to be a decorated general. People need to see this. Respect our veterans. Passengers around him nodded in agreement. "We should demand they take action," Mrs. Donovan said firmly. "This behavior is unacceptable." One of the flight attendants, Megan, the blonde who had been hesitant earlier, suddenly spoke up. "Actually," she said, glancing toward the galley, "I think action is already being taken." Just then, the galley door swung open. Laura stepped out, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her entire demeanor had changed. She looked broken. She made her way back down the aisle, but she wasn't walking with the same arrogance as before. This time she looked small. Passengers stared at her, unblinking. The weight of their glares was crushing. Then, in a low, serious voice, Captain Reynolds spoke over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to inform you that flight attendant, Laura Hastings, has been relieved of duty, effective immediately. She will no longer be serving on this flight or any future flights with this airline." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the cabin. James Carter simply watched. He didn't gloat, he didn't smirk, he just observed as karma finally did its job. Laura stopped in front of his seat. She opened her mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to beg for forgiveness. But James just shook his head. "Save it." His voice was steady, firm. "Not interested." Laura's shoulders sagged. She turned and walked away. For the first time in her life, she was powerless. The rest of the flight continued in peaceful silence. The other flight attendants treated James with utmost respect, ensuring he was comfortable and had everything he needed. Megan even came by and softly said, "I'm really sorry about earlier. I should have spoken up sooner." James nodded. "It takes courage to admit that. Thank you." As the plane began its descent, James looked out the window, the city lights twinkling below. The world was full of people like Laura, people who judged others without knowing their story. But it was also full of people like Ethan, Mrs. Donovan, and Megan, people who stood up for what was right. And as far as James was concerned, that was enough to keep fighting for. As the plane descended, James Carter closed his eyes, feeling the hum of the engines beneath him. The tension from earlier had vanished, replaced by a newfound sense of justice. Laura Hastings had been held accountable. For once, the right thing had happened without him having to fight for it. But outside the cabin, the real fight was just beginning. As the aircraft touched down, passengers wasted no time. Ethan, the young man who had recorded Laura's treatment of James, uploaded the video the second they had cell service. He added a caption. "Disrespect a veteran. Lose your job. Flight attendant humiliates disabled vet without realizing he's a decorated general. Watch what happens next. Respect our heroes. Justice served." The video exploded instantly. Within minutes, thousands of retweets and shares. News outlets started picking it up. People flooded the airline's social media, demanding answers. The airline's PR team scrambled to do damage control, but it was too late. The world had already seen everything. As the passengers disembarked, a small group of airport staff and airline executives were waiting at the gate. One of them, a tall, well-dressed man in his 50s, immediately approached. "James, General Carter," he said, his voice deep with respect. "I'm Daniel Peterson, the airline's regional director. We just received word about what happened. On behalf of the company, I want to personally apologize. James nodded politely. I appreciate that. Peterson continued. The flight attendant involved has been terminated immediately. We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, especially against those who have served our country. James studied him for a moment before finally nodding. Good. Let's hope it doesn't happen again. Peterson swallowed. It won't. Just as James was about to leave, a commotion erupted near the check-in counters. It was Laura Hastings. She stood in front of another airline manager, her face red and blotchy from crying. You can't just fire me like this, she shouted, her voice trembling. It was a misunderstanding. I was just doing my job. The manager, completely unfazed, sighed. Ma'am, the evidence is overwhelming. Not only have we fired you, but with this video going viral, good luck getting hired by any other airline. Laura froze. Her eyes flickered over to James. For the first time since this all started, she looked truly terrified. James met her gaze without an ounce of sympathy. Some lessons in life? You had to learn the hard way. As James walked toward the exit, Ethan caught up to him. Sir, he said, a little nervous. Would you like to say anything? You know. Since the whole world is watching now. James paused. He had never sought attention, never wanted the spotlight. But this was an opportunity. He turned to Ethan's phone, looked straight into the camera, and spoke. Respect isn't about wealth, status, or privilege. It's about decency. It's about seeing people for who they truly are, not just what they look like. Some people forget that, but life has a way of reminding them. He gave a small nod. To those who stood up today, thank you. That's the kind of world we should be fighting for. Ethan grinned. That was perfect. As James stepped out into the fresh air, he felt lighter than he had in years. The fight hadn't been a battle this time. There were no weapons, no explosions, just truth. And today, truth had won.